Hello and welcome to Appendix 3 of the video series or pilin Toki Pona. In this one, I'm going to talk about the question, how do we learn language? Now, in the past, I had the idea that I could learn a rule from a book, and this rule might be a bit difficult. I might need to really concentrate when I apply this rule. But if I get really good and I get faster and faster, then eventually it would become automatic and I would have learnt the rule. And then the more rules I learn, the better I get at the language until I've mastered the language. At the time it seemed logical to me. Maybe it sounds familiar to you as well. Stephen Krashen says no. A lot of people say no. Stephen Krashen says something very specific. He says that learning does not become acquisition. What does this mean? In the last video, we talked about explicit and implicit learning and explicit and implicit knowledge. In his book, Principles and Practice, Stephen Krashen makes the learning acquisition distinction, and it works in parallel. So what he says is when you learn a language, that's when you're memorizing words. This word, it means this word in my language, and this word means this word in my language. And you're memorizing grammar, or you're learning grammar rules. Like this is the order of the words in the sentence, and when it's past tense, the word changes like this, and when it's future tense, the word changes like that, and so on. So this is language learning. Stephen Krashen says language acquisition is a totally different thing. It's implicit, and learning does not become acquisition. Now, when you first hear this, that learning does not become acquisition, you might say to yourself, well, why should that be? Why can't it become acquisition? It might sound like Krashen is saying that there's kind of a barrier in the mind, and there's learning that puts knowledge in one side of the mind, and there's acquisition that puts knowledge in the other side of the mind, and there's this invisible barrier in the mind, and the knowledge can't go from one side to the other. It sounds like an odd claim, but actually this is following on from what we said before about explicit and implicit knowledge. Learning, acquisition, explicit, implicit, these are completely different kinds of knowing. It's not that you have the conscious mind and the subconscious mind, and knowledge that's in the conscious mind cannot, filter down to the subconscious mind. That's not what we're talking about at all. We are talking about two different kinds of knowledge. One kind of knowledge does not become the other. Let me explain by talking about deduction and induction, deductive and inductive reasoning. So what's the difference between these two? Big words, don't worry. So deduction is when you start with a rule and you use the rule to generate examples. So let me give you an example. Let's say that the rule is +2, for example. That's the rule. So deduction is when I use this rule to generate examples. So what does that mean? I would start with 2, and then 4, and then 6, and then 8, and so on. So that would be an example of deduction. What's induction? Induction is the other way. With induction, you start with the examples, and you use the examples to work out the rule. So let me give you an example of that. So here's number 1. What do you think the rule is? What's the rule? What do you think the next thing is? What do you think the next one is? Do you think it's 4? Wrong. What could the rule be? Oh, maybe it's Fibonacci. Maybe it's Fibonacci. It's like 3 is 2 plus 1 and 5 is 3 plus 2. So maybe the next one's 8. Nope. Ah, I get it. It's 1, 2, 3, 5, 1, 2, 3, 5, 1, 2, 3, 5 repeating. Maybe that's it. Yeah, maybe. Who knows? See, that's induction. You gather examples. You start with a few examples. When you've only got one example, you know nothing. When you've got 2 and 3 examples, you might have some guesses. The more examples you get, the more sure you are of what the rule is. And the point with language acquisition here is that language acquisition is an inductive process. And when you learn language from books, from grammar rules, from dictionaries, you are using a deductive process. So can you see that these are 2 different kinds of knowledge? These are 2 different ways of knowing. And in these videos, what I would like to say that what we have here is a rule, and what we have here, what's going on here with language acquisition, we're not even getting rules, because rules, as we just said, they're explicit. We're coming up with a pattern, an intuition, a kind of subconscious feeling that something is right or wrong. So what happens during language acquisition is an inductive process where we gather examples and we use those examples to come up with a feeling of what will come next. And then trying to express that feeling in words is what we do when we try to come up with a grammar book. Remember the example from the last video of the adjective order. When experts sit down and work out what the adjective order is in English, they don't look at rules. They're native speakers and they ask their intuition. They say, well, tall, thin, or thin, tall. No, thin, tall sounds wrong. It's tall, thin. They ask that intuition, that feeling they have. And where does that feeling come from? It comes from lots of examples. It comes from gathering lots of examples and then suddenly seeing the pattern among those examples. So that system you have in your mind, is it just asking yourself if you've ever heard something before? Well, not quite, because what you can do when you've recognized a pattern is you can then extrapolate. So like we had here, we had 1, 2, 3, 5, 1, 2, okay, so the next one must be 3 then. And so we use the pattern and then extrapolate from the pattern to try and find other examples. I'll give you an example of this. One of the most famous experiments in language acquisition research, what they do is they get little kids, or what they did for this experiment, they showed them this picture and they said, this is a wug. Now there is another one. There are 2 of them. There are 2. And the kid says, wugs. The kid says, wugs. Now that child never heard the word wug before. The researcher said it. And they most certainly had never heard the word wugs before it came out of their own mouth. How did they know to do that? When they asked their little systems in their minds, have you ever heard the word wugs before? The system would say no. But the question isn't, have you ever heard it before? It's, does it sound right? So, of course, the data comes first. You know, have I ever heard this word before? Yes or no. But also you extrapolate from the patterns. So you have, you know, trees, books, cars, dogs, wugs. Yeah, it's a pattern. It makes sense. And so that internal system is fundamentally data. The data comes first, but we also use the patterns that we found among those examples to work out what could come next. We kind of extrapolate to other examples. I'll tell you a funny story. When I must have been about 7, there was a little girl that I knew, and she must have been 5 or something, and she would insist on saying mans instead of men. And that's something that they call U-shaped progress or something, whereby you start with knowing nothing and then you acquire a rule, but then you use the rule too much. And that was what she was doing. She had gotten enough data to work out the plural in English, that you add a z or s on a word to say that there's more than one, but she hadn't quite got enough data yet to realize that you can't say mans. Whenever you have more than one man, it's men, for example. But still, the data is king. It's a data-driven process. That's the point here. So how does the process get started? Well, very recently there's been some fascinating research into something called statistical language learning. So what these researchers do is they get little babies and they use these artificial languages. I say languages. It's just gobbledygook. It doesn't mean anything, but there are patterns within the gobbledygook, within the sounds, and they see if the babies can learn the patterns. So one of the most famous studies is Safran, Newport, and Aslin in '96. Statistical learning by 8-month-old infants. 8 months, they can't walk yet. And what they do is they get them first to listen to a couple of minutes of this. Pabiku tubi dogola tu daro pi tubi do pabiku. Just that for like a couple of minutes. And they make sure that every syllable is the same tone and there's the same gap between them. So it all sounds like just one long word. But in fact, this is actually 3-syllable words. And you see this is repeating, right? Pabiku here, right? So what they were looking for was to see if the babies are doing some kind of statistical analysis, because the only way they could know that pabiku is a word and not, let's say, tudaro, is by analyzing the likelihood of one syllable coming after another. So after pa, always comes b. After b, always comes tu, because comes ku. But after ku, well, it could be anything. So they found that the babies were actually working it out, because what they would do is after they listened to this audio, they would do an experiment and they would say one word like pabiku, and they would say another word that didn't actually exist in the input, like tudaro, for example, or pitubi or something like that. And the babies reacted differently. So it meant that their little minds were picking up on the statistical regularities in the input. So word boundaries, basically. 8-month-olds, right? They can't even walk yet. And yet their brains are automatically picking up on these regularities, automatically analyzing the data, if you like. Does this work for grammar structures as well? Well, Gomez and Gerken, 98. Artificial grammar learning by 1-year-olds leads to specific and abstract knowledge. So it's a little bit like the other experiment, but this time it's a grammar thing. So they came up with this artificial grammar, with this artificial language, with these words that mean nothing. And you have this system whereby you can generate valid sentences. So for example, you could have vot, pel, jik, and that's it. Or you could have pel, tam, pel again, jik, rod, tam, rud again, end, right? So you can, but you can't go from vot to tam, for example, right? So this gives you a system of generating valid sentences. Again, they generated a bunch of sentences from this grammar system. They gave these 1-year-olds, they made these 1-year-olds listen to this gobbledygook for a couple of minutes. And then what they did was they did some tests with some new sentences. Some of the new sentences followed these rules, and some of the new sentences didn't. There was the same words, but in an order that was incorrect according to this system. And do you know they could tell the difference? They reacted differently to the two sentences, or the two kinds of sentence. So none of these sentences in the experiment had they ever heard before. So when they started with these generated sentences in the first stage, the babies were listening to these generated sentences in the first stage, but in the second stage of the experiment, they were all completely new sentences. The babies had not heard any of those sentences before. The only difference was that some of them were grammatical and some of them weren't, but they could tell the difference. Their minds had worked out the system. 1-year-olds. Isn't that amazing? This is the power of your subconscious mind. Okay, but this is for word boundaries and maybe abstract repeating things, elements. What about actual meaningful words? Well, yes, of course. But what we call that is comprehensible input. So it's worth talking very specifically about what comprehensible input is. In the introduction video, we said that when you have the thought, but you don't have all of the words, this is comprehensible input. So, of course, the first thing we have to do is talk about what is input. Input is meaningful communication. If I just practice a sentence, let's say I've learnt a grammar rule and I've come up with some sentences and I'm just practicing the sentences, this is not meaningful communicative input. What's language? Language is a system that we use to get our thoughts into each other's minds. If that's happening, then it's input. It doesn't matter if it's you talking to me or if it's you talking to somebody else. It doesn't matter if it's two people talking. It doesn't matter if it's an article that somebody has written for somebody else. These are all examples of communication, but they're real communication. That's the input side of things. The comprehensible side of things is when I understand the thought. That's the important point here. Comprehensible. If I have all of the thought and I also understand the words, then Krashen calls this transparent input. And obviously, if I have none of the thought and none of the words, then it's incomprehensible input. Incomprehensible input, is it useful? Well, like we just saw with those experiments, it might be useful for working out word boundaries. It might be useful for working out, repeating sounds and elements. It might be useful for that, but, language has got to mean something, right? So it really needs to be comprehensible input. It doesn't need to be 100% of the meaning, but you do need to have a high enough amount of the meaning to feel like you got something from the communication, and then it's comprehensible input. A little sidebar here. You might say to me, well, how can you talk about statistical language learning and comprehensible input in the same video? Isn't comprehensible input like Krashen and Chomsky and generativists, and aren't they kind of like this? Here's what I say to that. All models are wrong, but some models are useful. And, the generativist model is very useful. And the statistical language learning thing is also very useful. It's all very useful. And the point is, all roads lead to Rome in this case, in what we're saying, that this is a data-driven process. It's bottom-up, it's inductive. That's the bottom line here. So there. One other point. What I+1 isn't, you might have heard that comprehensible input is about I+1. It's about finding content that's a little bit above your level. That's not what it is. You might think that I+1, it's like, let's say you're here, and what you're looking for is content where the level of the language is just a little bit above you, and this is your I+1. No, that's not what I+1 is. I+1 specifically means when you get comprehensible input, and that comprehensible input contains an element that you're ready to acquire, you acquire it. So your language system contains lots of elements. This is a very crude example here. Okay, so this is your system in your mind with all these elements. And when you get comprehensible input, and that comprehensible input contains an element that you're ready for, that is your I+1, and your brain takes that and adds it to the system. That's the point of I+1. Now, notice, comprehensible input. What did we just say comprehensible input is? Comprehensible input is when you have the meaning. Nothing to do with level. Sure, if the language that you're hearing is at a level that's a little bit above your level, then is it easier to understand the meaning? Sure, because you can maybe get 80%, 90% of the meaning from the words that you already know. It doesn't have to be that way. Look at what I'm doing in these videos. I'm giving you comprehensible input. You're at 0 in Toki Pona, but I'm giving you comprehensible input. I'm giving you 100% of the meaning from pictures and gestures and noises and sounds and context and so on. So the point is, when you get comprehensible input, that's when it happens. Is it comprehensible to you? That's the question. If it is comprehensible input, then that comprehensible input, because it contains words that you don't understand yet and structures you don't understand yet, your brain will take from that what it's ready to take. That's the concept of I+1. And again, I'm talking about this because some people have got the idea that comprehensible input is like a video that is kind of simple, like an intermediate level, and there are pictures and stuff so you can understand it better. And so a comprehensible input video is kind of beginner, intermediate level, and that comprehensible input is for that level. No. Comprehensible input runs the show from beginning to end. That's the point here. It's an inductive, data-driven process from 0, from the get-go. And that's how it runs throughout. So, does explicit language learning help you at all? Well, for sure it can, in at least 2 ways. For one thing, it can make the input more comprehensible to you. If you've memorized a word explicitly, and then you encounter that in the territory, then, well, you've got a little bit of a map for the territory, and it helps you to understand what you're hearing and what you've got there. So it can help to make input more comprehensible. But, you know, if you're having to rely on explicit knowledge to understand everything, then it's not going to work. It's going to be too slow. So it can surely supplement the comprehensibility of the input that you get. The other thing that explicit knowledge can do is it can prime the way that your subconscious analyzes the data. We know this because of, well, first language interference, but of course also explicit knowledge can interfere with the way that the data is analyzed when you're getting it. So that can be a two-edged sword, because your, let's say, prejudices about the input that you're about to receive can help you and they can harm you. They can set you back. So to my mind, given that the whole process is driven by comprehensible input and it's data-driven anyway, why not use clean data? You know, why prejudice yourself? You know, if it's possible to have a native-like perception of the language, then why not do that? But of course, if you need to get the job done very fast, then having some conscious knowledge on hand is surely helpful. But the point here is that language acquisition is a data-driven, bottom-up, inductive process. So explicit knowledge and practicing on the basis of explicit knowledge and trying to get better and faster at using explicit knowledge is not going to work, because that's not what this is. So I hope that might be helpful, at least helpful ideas. For sure, go and research all of this. Don't trust anything I say. But I hope that this has been food for thought for you that might help you on your journey.